So good afternoon, dear audience, dear friends. I'll begin with probably the most familiar event within our symposium, kind of family affair. Many of us here, let's say, family affair, but this is probably the most family affair. Talking about the media or ex-Yugoslav Medialabs from Ljubljana to Novi Sad, with Luka, Frelih from Ljudmila, Ljubljana, Medak, Zagreb, and Zoran Pantelić, from Novi Sad. In a sense, this was we wanted also, and also with some of you already conversing about the conference of the topics. We also got somehow the impression that probably those 20 years is a kind of good starting point or good period to reflect upon it. I mean, backwards, to historize it. And it's probably not just the case with us here in post-Yugoslav, ex-Yugoslav countries in this specific cultural field that we are now trying to historicize it. Already it was already Vuk in 2000s here with the historicizing of the history of arts, and this was history of arts for airports, somehow doing this grand gesture of somehow looking back into the history of media and culture. Let's say what we have thought initially in doing this discussion, doing this panel, was not just to historicize, but also maybe to, let's say, try, if it's possible in a sense now, maybe that we are elder and wiser, hopefully, somehow to see what were not just the our mutual or our respective missions, initial missions, why we have set up spaces and collectives that were operative for rather long period. Not just it, but now maybe also, and also not to come up if some changes happen, because actually we could guess that the changes happen, but maybe also to look up on the prospects of not just of media labs, hack labs, but also of this kind of engagement in a very specific local environment. Also, maybe just coming again to the question of Arkzin, what was for us interesting, especially in that case, which was here in Mama, was maybe of lesser importance. Was of how much also the setup of such venues in the 90s was then formatted by, let's say, by some foreign or outside or external actors, be it, let's say, the Soros Open Society Foundation, some Dutch, let's say, or other money and organizations. That it was, let's say, kind of driving force, at least for in the initial year. So maybe we'll start around taking up maybe just on the issue of historicizing and of the initial missions. Now, just asking all of you, maybe just to start with Zoran, what would you think was the prime mission of your engagement in Novi Sad, and why have you chosen then a specific kind of to open up a venue to engage in that way, which was, let's say, at least for Novi Sad, totally innovative format?
Yeah, in a way, it was actually very simple. Reflect on our place where we actually worked before as an artist, and then we just established the new form of collaborating and engaging the other collaborators, but in general we didn't think on that way to be from very beginning extraordinary, original in a way. It was more happened to us as a reflection of circumstances what we work in that time. First, in Novi Sad. When the organization is established in 2000. I must say maybe just brief background words. Then I'm coming from fine arts and the art group absolutely during the 90s, and basically it was our first touch with the technology and circus with what's happened during the 90s, and basically for me personally and for the group was actually very interesting how we touched with it, because it was a first step out of this very traditional, let's say, conservative structure of education in our schools. And basically, it was a pretty much new platform to meet with the other people and authorities from the fields and to mix and to understood some potential of technology. And then we actually start to experiment with it. But to be honest, from the beginning was actually very selfish. Then we are actually enjoying to mix and experiment with technology and to touch some fields. But very soon we understood through these practices, what we see it in Europe, then it's really important to create a kind of more complex structure, not only for permanent, consistency. It was actually in Serbian circumstances actually reflect very briefly and very soon. Then these artistic experimental acts are very weak. I mean, basically, you can't move nothing. Then we actually just understood, and we had to really establish something more, more stable. It was running our art production and collecting some let's say information books, whatever, and in networking with other figures from generation in especially with the net time and syndicalist meetings. It was kind of broader kind of platform that we understood, and it could be interesting to create something. It could be kind of possible lab. But now with this distance after 13 years, it looks like a planned, structure. But basically, we never really planned how to really develop, in a long term, structure. It was just a necessity then to create something. Then it could be more deeper even for our own, and to create more collaborative platform for other,
Maybe just to add up a side question of how much actually your local background. I mean, in Novi Sad. Especially also then now in the years you have done something of historicizing the Novi Sad avant-garde scene of the 60s and the 70s. And also just yesterday here you're brought up on his way to Ljubljana, Želimir Žilnik, important filmmaker, and let's say still very much of importance for all of us here. Of how much your let's say, since you have set up a venue, but let's say coming from fine arts or arts field mostly, how much you have, let's say, kind of have been in touch with them, or was it then later on that you somehow?
No, it's come up from the very beginning, basically. And I grew up with them, for instance, and then they actually, we share some metro books, whatever. And from the very beginning, actually, now I understood it's actually very extraordinary. But in that moment, it was actually completely natural for us to live with them and to questionize what's happened with those people who are actually marginalized completely, and then we realized on all this very complex political and social structure, and later on we actually try to analyze ourselves, how we actually dealing as a group, how we start, and which is actually come up with all these issues of authorship, collective work, all other stuff which we find it and name it in during the new technology practice which comes up, and then through this line we actually, as a parallel track of all our other interests, we actually start to deal with this analyzing neo-avant-garde movement from Novi Sad, which is actually pretty much interesting for us to find some extraordinary practice. Of course, when we create kind of a, let's say, global comparative study, we can find a lot of similarities, of course, and it's nothing really 100% original, but especially for our practice and for this connection with our generation and what's happened in the 60s, we find one line which has to be open. So one of the interests is start to create, and of course we find also very interesting then not only remembering or to reactivate some practices, or to put it on a spotlight as a interesting structure. It's also important to criticize, and then because usually when the people want to deal with it comes to different two spots on the edge, and then one it's completely marginalized, or the other one it's a mythological, aspects, and everything was fine. So that was kind of main interest to find and to understand actually even ourselves better, what it's, because we start to learn much more through this platform. And then basically in technical, in a formal thing was happened. Then in 2000 we registered the organization, and the first basic benefit or capital what we improved was actually people from the network what we met during the 90s.
Thank you. So now coming to Luka, your case at least was also your venue was the high point for much of us, and also during the initial time, at least Vasi and Mama, but also then I guess for Kuda and for our friends, also some of them from Belgrade and other cities from ex-Y. Ljudmila was the beacon of the new. So please could you elaborate maybe something around the context that Ljudmila was set up, and also maybe what was, just like now Zoran did, that they came from an artist background, of how much, let's say, the mixture of people there and the different maybe initiatives, what was the ecology behind Ljudmila?
Okay, so yeah, I'm not coming from art background. 20 years ago I was a programmer, a physics student, techie guy, and I came to a meeting which was kind of the second step in forming Ljudmila. The first was basically in the art context, a kind of conference or panel talk where many practitioners of that time in Ljubljana pointed out that while they are interested in working with technology, in developing technology art projects, they don't have conditions. They don't have a place, or there is no community for them to meet with people who are more technically oriented or have more technical competences. And it was a moment kind of in end of 93, begin 94, when the internet technology came out of the strictly academic and military sphere into kind of more everyday life, and also to basically Soros was at that time already supporting efforts of academic network, basically buying modems for leased lines for schools. So this was a kind of preconditions came together. So Mitja Doma, working at Soros Open Society Institute Foundation in Ljubljana at that time, kind of answered the call for this venue, for this context, with saying, okay, in Kud France Epperscheren we already have a non-profit desktop publishing laboratory, which was set up a bit earlier. There was already a basic internet connection there. So he said, okay, the initial conditions are here. We can offer some more funds, and you can start work if you want. Basically, this was where I come, and to me it was a kind of nice opportunity to switch from context of work, kind of from being on the sidelines of kind of big corporations. I was working as kind of user group of OS2 at that time, so we were, like I said, technical people. We had I was collaborating in Radio Student with some basically computer show, and already then talking about Linux, and open source became a kind of visible as a concept. So for me it was nice to be able to have a perspective, kind of free work, not working for a big multinational corporation. Like I said, I had some experience in IBM in a very non-formal way, but still it's a kind of weird dynamic. And also Microsoft Slovenia was forming at that time, but this was kind of avoiding the fate of being bought out and trying to help some other process which could use some people who know what digital communications, how they work. And so from this, basically we started to meet, I think first weekly or something like that in that place, in the DTP lab, then even more frequently. Basically this was looking at the internet, what is there, what is the web, kind of, for me, the web was a radically simpler way to put content on screen in a computer. It was kind of open version of Microsoft Word technology, but connected with links. And so this was not just for me, but at that time it looked like a really revolutionary medium. So the kind of first things that Ljudmila started to develop with the money from Soros was a kind of non-profit shared infrastructure in the sense of internet server, and also some machines to produce the content put on the server. So there was a kind of initial group, or let's say maybe a kind of fragments of groups coming together and starting to work in the small space which was in CUD and also on the server. We were very happy to give out email accounts, web accounts, and at that time we even had our own dial-up lines. At one point it was like 30 lines. In parallel, people could call up and have free, cost-free access to internet. Soon we kind of grew up out of the small place where we were kind of guests, the desktop publishing lab, and already we visited by that time a place like Backspace in England, which was a kind of artist-run space open for crazy ideas and non-commercial. So I think we picked up a bit on that ethos from them when we set up the first venue space of Ljudmila. It was on the outskirts of Ljubljana. We basically had no money for space, so we took what was available from the city at that time. And in that space, we set up basically a wireless connection. It was the kind of agile way to connect. We kind of always had wireless hookup, even to this day in Ljudmila. At that time, there was no Wi-Fi, so we had to solder our own. For instance, this was kind of coming together, not just some people from software background, but also people with hardware, electronics, radio amateurs, which I would say Marko Pilhan kind of brought in to the team. So there was also joined Ljudmila at the time, a non-profit video studio, kind of grew out of the refugee TV, kind of basically Soros then got this equipment, and some people from Sarajevo, namely Amra Bakšić, Bojan Mastilović, and Emir Jelkić were the most active. They were running a non-profit documentation production, video production. So this, and all the while we with Vuk and others, we were kind of networking heavily meeting people who are calling themselves net artists. Also, the net time, as already mentioned, was a kind of the social network at that time growing.
So what years are those?
So this was kind of from 93 to 97 now. In the 96 was this big conference that we brought, was the 97, sorry. The only ever net time conference, which was not a parasite event on some other big conference, was in Ljubljana. We published at that time a kind of compendium, a big printed 10,000 editions of net time compendium. Even before in Ljudmila, Vuk was like an arena also, kind of. We had a kind of experiment in new media format called Very Cyber Indeed. It was a printed magazine with contributions by people we met through online or email, and the maximum size of an article was 100 words. So you can see how some other experiments today in this direction went much bigger, like Twitter.
140 characters.
No, it was 100 words. We were not radical enough, I would say, at that time. But
one thing is that your venue actually, and then the bunch of older people from Ljubljana, some of whom are, let's say, come major figures, of how much the issue that you're among those venues now we collected here on a panel, that you were probably the only one running really proper, I mean big infrastructure, or at least for us big infrastructure, of how much actually not just, let's say, now I can not just speak about free software but also about free hardware, of how much running infrastructure which unusual people, let's say, coming from other fields would regard just to be, let's say, almost insignificant act, of how much having this infrastructure for your own and then developing, hosting many people on it, was it critical? So would you say that there were some specifics into it? They were really not masters of universe, but let's say at least trying to subvert some of the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the kind of first consequence was a slightly earlier visibility of, and kind of we introduced not just internet to, not just the Slovenian kind of independent Arkzin at the time to the internet, we also introduced internet to them. It was kind of for us a way to engage people perhaps in a very practical hands-on way with the internet. So we're just like, okay, today you will get an internet page. So how do you think about yourself and your art, and how would you represent? You know, this was kind of Vuk had on one-on-one sessions with this artist and say, hello, yes, this looks very confusing, but in the fact it's just like, you know, making a flyer.
You said yesterday that you paid in free sandwiches.
Yeah, that was the very non-profit basis of the. I mean, it was a very funny way how Ljudmila never almost was kind of official. So at the first 5 years or 6, we were absolutely non-existent as a legal entity. We were a program inside Soros Foundation. It was not customary for them to have programs which cost money inside. Usually they gave money to other people. So it was kind of okay to buy servers, but to pay people was very weird and kind of hard to manage. So yes, we were there, we had internet, we had equipment, and we had sandwiches. And luckily, Vuk didn't have a child yet. I had still some kind of support from my family, from my parents, and it took a while to realize that yes, actually, you know, to have a sustainable space, you need to pay some people, especially for the most boring work. And So in 2001, Soros cuts the money, and we moved legally from Soros into the Coup Français Prêcheur. It's a very old cultural organization which had physically hosted Ljudmila servers forever, where that DTP lab was, and so it was kind of natural, but we were again programmed within a bigger thing. This was kind of the low point of money. We had really nothing at that time. We somehow magically managed to move to the center, into a new space, because that previous one was not heated. And also we were never sure when we were going to get kicked out, because of ownership basically was unclear. But then we start to, of course, apply like everybody else in the scene to state and city, and it took a while. Let's say it took 10 years to start to get money also for art production, which is kind of the normal way of funding this kind of institution or place in Ljubljana. And now, 2 years ago, we formalized an independent association because of basically pragmatic reasons. We started a big project called Culture C. It was quite a big budget, which was, if we would get it to would probably be evaporate, because of it's a big debt in that place. And so it was a time where we said, okay, if we don't become Ljudmila, we cannot do this project. So now we are an independent association. We are starting to get money independently, which, because of the stupid way the art is funded, is actually means now we get 3 times more, even that everything is being cut. But we kind of, from B grade, we come into A grade finally now. First league, kind of, hopefully that we succeed. But let's say we are still in Slovenia, so there is no way to independently raise money for something like this. You know, let's say hacker spaces, there is a kind of ethos of this new wave of Medialabs, that they are kind of very financially independent and members pay to be there. That is, I think, a kind of non-working scenario in this part of the world. It's kind of expected that we get the public money and then everything is for free for our customers.
You get declared as cultural heritage, and
yeah, we try.
You get upgraded.
We try. We have all the status possible.
To come to the third case, and now just try not to put too many questions. This will be more schizophrenic than with our family affair. This will be talking almost to alter ego. Tom, maybe just to give, let's say, some kind of elaborate, decisive statement. What was actually the mission of MAMA, a Multimedia Institute, when we started in 1999-2000?
I should say that it's we were not, in a way, at the beginning of the story, neither you nor me. It was rather Marcel and Tel, who are not today here. And I think that MAMA, in that sense, was coalescence or crystallization of several tendencies or several processes, or just dynamics, maybe that would be a more correct word. One was obviously of friendship, and that's how we came together and expanded, first Theo and Marcel, and then the rest of us coming together. The other one has to do with Marcel escaping the conscription into the army and going to London to volunteer at the Backspace and get infatuated with internet, and then coming back and moving to Labin, this small town in almost at the coast in Istria, where there was a cultural center run by an artist collective, Labin Art Express, where Marcel has started sort of a small vestigial form of Media Lab. And this was like 98, 97. And this is where we kind of also then were recognized by the local Soros Foundation, who have obviously seen that there is a model to establishing media labs. And as they already had internet program, they invited us on board, and we kind of took over whatever was there and initiated the whole Mama story. But in terms of technology, what was our first point of coming together was this idea that we should somehow put a wedge into a situation where all the electronic media was controlled by Croatian Democratic Union and the nationalists, and that we should use and this is looking from today's perspective a bit silly, but that we should use the potential of internet radio, of all technologies, to put a wedge in there, insofar as it would allow first to have sort of a public medium, but also would allow for a very horizontal form of organizing the program. So you could have your own form and your own interest to articulate and formulate your or create your own program around that. There was no scarcity of programming schedule, and that at some point would maybe be the structure that we could use to create an actual wave radio, which actually never happened. And internet radio at the time was pretty rudimentary and hard for people to use. But our initial meetings that we organized in Labin were dealing primarily with that, and we were trying to bring together a number of people whom we kind of recognized in the context, particularly Zagreb context of anti-war movement, to try to formulate different social critical agendas or topics, and to give them a mediatic form. So I think that those 3 or 4 strands came together and coalesced in this idea that we should create Mama. And then when we started working in the spaces of Soros Foundation, which was just here around the corner on Hebrangova Street, and we were slowly kind of expanding our activities and projects, most of them having to do with working with people, educating them how to use internet, how to create web pages and similar such things. We came to understand that infrastructure is important, that there was always a social moment behind internet as a medium. This also obviously was the idea behind the internet radio, that there should be kind of the cohesion from bottom up that should create the program of this. And we thought that a space where people could meet is just as important as a server farm. And we had both initially, and the space then did really work. It spawned many other things. We opened also a cyber cafe, which also gave us public presence, and then that meant that people were coming to surf, but also suddenly people who didn't really have access to, I don't know, DJ decks or to a PA system would come, play their music. and that created smaller communities within our structure, which then led us basically later to start working more with free software and to have our own free music label. So that was kind of one organic development. Another one that was that many of us had background in the humanities, and we were interested in doing theory, and then started to kind of organize around this and try to provide discourse to what was happening. And I think that was also, in a way, it came in the same lineage as Arkzin, and in the sense there is sort of a close relation there. We also worked in those early years with then ailing Arkzin. It was all then the period post-journal. It was really just the end years of Arkzin, where we collaborated on translating and publishing some books such as Empire and similar such literature. So this is always a heterogeneous intent behind, and there is a structure of friendship and the idea that infrastructure is important within that particular context of late 90s in Zagreb and Croatia, where it was still dominated by the nationalist, both in terms of politics and in terms of culture and cultural production. So Opening Mama was one of the first spaces that was independently run alongside with Attack and Močvara. That was pretty much it. And then one of the initial ideas that we had is that we should give our resources to everybody to use as they want, so in a way to self-organize. Be they DJs who had to figure out their own schedule when will they play the music, or be those artistic initiatives or human rights NGOs who then come in and use the space. So I don't think that there was one single mission. There was kind of a number of ambitions that I think coalesced.
Maybe also to a more specific question is also actually different. When we are trying to program this small conference, we had pains of how to get to historicize at least the notion and also the practices of tactical media. And then within the title you see we have radical media, which then has a bit a different undertone, but let's say for us now radical means tactical. It's interesting maybe that you, Tom, that you elaborate, since when we are opening Mama and setting up Multimedia Institute, we are neither artists nor programmers per se, so it's actually kind of vagrant intellectuals of how much, while we are still, let's say, for at least in our self-understanding, tacticality or tactical media, or the notion of the tactics as it was proposed by then in the late 90s by our Dutch friends, and then proposed then through many mailing lists, that actually we are still kind of attached to it, and that, let's say, that's how would you explain this paradox or this contradiction that we are still, let's say, attached to the tactical, to the notion of the tacticality of the tactics, while actually we are totally obsessed with setting up new institutions which we hope will last forever. So I would say is how you then reconnect it with the notion of the tactics and the tacticality.
Yeah, I guess one of the early things that kind of was in the debate was what is there that could be changed in the context of our work, rather than what is it that we should do as an activity. So opportunities that provided themselves were just as formative as our ideas what what we should do and how we should intervene into the context. And that meant then that we tried to bring together, or always worked on bringing together people working in a field rather than working in a field. That was the driving force behind many of activities which took several streams. One of the streams was obviously cultural policy, where we were bringing together organizations in non-institutional cultural sector in Croatia to work together to transform the way the framework of financing culture and supporting culture and supporting infrastructure for culture was set up in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s. Second was, and came a bit later, around spatial justice and urban development policies that led into Right to the City movement. And I think that was something that probably also has a personal aspect to it, insofar as it is still always thinks in terms of where can we really act and not just have an ambition to act, or where we really can change something. So I think that was what was behind, or what ties together the idea that we should create something more stable, infrastructures, but that our mode of working should be tactics, and that is recognizing where there is an opportunity to engage, rather than trying to deduct from ambition where that engagement should be.
Maybe just to come up with the point Anthony has asked in the first panel, in the first round, about this, let's say, kind of delay, or this kind of inter time, between time. Let's say at the point where infrastructure has to be somehow set up, or it had to be set up by the state, in the sense of actually making it available then maybe for capitalism to co-opt or to adopt, to appropriate it. For amateur, I would say that actually for at least for two of those institutions, for Kuda and for Mama, but also for Ljudmila, maybe it went so that at some point, or maybe they are somehow regarded to be kind of totally coming out of a field which is, at least the driving ethos is to be non-representative, to be marginal, outsiderish. Actually, that all, at least two or three, but maybe even all three institutions or initiatives had been, let's say, kind of regarded to be the representatives of their own countries or their own states. Or how much actually we had kind of different kind of attitude towards the state, or the state apparatus, or also to the municipal apparatuses in our cities, actually to running this kind of spaces, to running this kind of infrastructure initiatives. Is it maybe something different than, and this at least was our experience, always hosting people then usually from the West coming to Mama? It was usually then they ask, oh, but you're not squatting, so you actually are also getting money by the state, by the city, you're fighting them, but nevertheless you're not anarchists, you're not squatters. So it was always very difficult to explain how it functions, and this was also then the point Luka has brought up. So that there's actually almost kind of expectancy that there's a kind of something with the state, so it's not total, let's say, kind of subversion of total underground vis-a-vis the state apparatus. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
I could just add some parts which is actually explain some brief history genesis. Then, as I understood, and Soros was actually invest a lot of money to create these labs for technological knowledge, and it was add also with already existed network of Soros offices and Center for Contemporary Arts in the region. And basically all those programs actually was come up as a spin-off projects of Soros Foundation with money. And János is here also. Then actually the biggest center was in Budapest, in CQ. And is it? let's say biggest, but was.
Okay, it's true, but the story started a little bit in a different way. So, because Soros wasn't really interested in contemporary art, but his second wife was an art historian, and that's why, because his first foundations or activity was concentrated on Hungary, and because of his wife, he established a Center for Contemporary Art, SCCA, and in the early 90s he just wanted to close it down because it was rather, let's say, feudalistic place, as the Hungarians, Hungarian professionals used it. You know, this was the office you could go for a free telephone call, and all the money was already gave out before the competitions, etc. And at that time, a new person started to work there as a translator. She was Susie, and when Soros came, she could persuade him to give an extra 3 months of probation, and she reorganized the whole thing. And this is the story of SCCA. And after that, years later, the second half of the 90s, the Hungarian Soros office became extremely lame in terms of communication and internet, but the SCCA was extremely active on the other hand. And this was the time, early 90s, or first part of the 90s, when she started to organize the network of networks. And it was a strange move because they could involve silicon graphics. Maybe there is some people who remember to that company. Silicon graphics, the Hungarian Telecom, and the Soros office, and the C-Cube was established by those three companies, and since that it's true because it became really big, and again, as you, Luka, said, in the early 2000s, the step by step the financial support was cut back, and then C-Cube now is let's say a kind of an independent body, and of course they can do significantly less. So they are active more or less as an office. They don't have this broad activity they had before.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually just missed this puzzle then to understand a bit clearly. But what I want to say is it's connect with already existing network and offices in the region, and basically this spin-off was actually create the platform for technological knowledge, and that was actually a great opportunity. But what we are talking now, it's actually then who are the people who actually start to develop this, and then exactly that what you mentioned, it's pretty much reflect on the personal sensibilities, how they will develop or how to create the track in which direction, how will develop in the future. And that's the facts. Then people who are sitting here and create some platforms and to provide some specific track to bridge people from theory or from technology and arts, and to create some specific parts. Talking about the task of the labs, what could be from the very beginning, it's just to making kind of a general labs for spread internet knowledge for general people. But I mean, then the editors are really pretty much use this, and it's a fact. For instance, in Belgrade, it doesn't exist something like this. It's actually spread in a different direction. It's same through this personal accessibility, in my point of view. It was actually developed in a different parts, mostly in a lab of B92 in that time. But then Dražen and others are actually spanned out from Belgrade, and it doesn't exist in such a form as we are talking now. So this is kind of, as I see it in how it's developed, this kind of very first step of investment, you know, for creating kind of platforms. And then it comes up then how the people actually deals with this as a policy, you know, how to deal with this openness structure, and because for me, talking about this and mentioned to the space, as you mentioned, I think it's important as we are having meeting like this, it's then people could be on a network connecting, but through these meetings are people actually going deeply and to understand and contexts and to be more clearly how to develop some more ideas. Of course, then any network, it's very heterogenic, but in such a platforms, then people can go further. And I think this kind of, you know, thinking about the context and create kind of a framework of some physical platforms, it helps a lot to provide or to design some specific
maybe, excuse me, Zoran, I will ask you then again about the state. So it's, what do you think is so that actually setting up this kind of spaces, autonomous infrastructure, which is hopefully autonomous, but nevertheless expecting somehow the public money, I mean the local public money. So do you think so in sense of engagement has it seems something really to be at point that, especially since for some of the institutions here that Soros at the point where they left this region, or they left totally financing this kind of things, has it changed, or is this, let's say, kind of flavor of this kind of venues in Eastern Europe somehow different than the venues in the, let's say, at least in the western part of Europe or US, where actually at us here you have to, in a small specific countries, cities, you have to be at least in some relation to the state apparatus, to the municipal apparatus, and not, let's say, you cannot be totally oblivious of it. Even squatting is actually difficult.
It is, but it's actually, depends. I can't agree totally, but in generally, what was actually the background of Absolutno was something that we actually just used this very provincial visibility of authorities, how they actually recognizing us as a successful artist group who was actually internationally visible, you know. And then when we actually start to pushing them, then they actually just, you know, start to communicate in that terms. I mean, we just start simply using this tool of public, calls to establish something. Then we actually argue then it's missing in a culture field, and it's, you know, it deals with it, and basically it was starting position, and because we never really get such a big amount of money to really establish. One thing you also mentioned now, which is actually remind me about, in both cases, then you mentioned, then it was actually a lot of money to establish the infrastructure, but you mentioned then without honorariums and the problem for the...
This is the case here as well.
So, but what's happened for us, for instance, when we actually start to create the actions and platform in Novi Sad, it was actually the biggest problem each time when we applied, then they said it's not allowed to buy a technology. Then you have to work with the specific bodies, you know, and it's out of this structure. Then you are on a different position. So basically, we have this kind of paradoxical completely opposite situation, and then we try to explain them why we actually asking for infrastructure just to create kind of open platform. So basically. That's the reason why I mentioned the Belgrade spots, what was actually designed on that way, but it actually never happened. And in this particular thing, then we actually create kind of we had few owners who was actually established the organization with me, and they invested their own money and their own equipment, and that was the basic investment. And then later on, we actually, through the projects, we grow with all other stuff. So it was slightly different than those two cases.
So Luka, for you, it was then from the hardship of the desert years when Soros left until you somehow hacked the system, and then as artists association got 3 times more the money. How was it?
You kind of from the you asked about what was our relationship to the state, and definitely in the last millennium, we were kind of operating despite the state. Definitely there was no engagement of any kind of politics into our work. We were exploiting in some small way the existing national infrastructure of academic network, which made it much easier for us to actually have and provide internet access to others. But we were kind of a bypass for culture to this academic network. They were nominally supposed to support culture, but the ministry wouldn't finance ARNETs, the network, so there was always kind of like. Then we didn't ask the tough questions, so the artists and independent, even non-formal groups could get the infrastructure through us. And then, of course, with it was a very radical, very sharp cut off for us of Soros. Basically, one day, just gone. So anybody who had, who needed kind of daily money left to go to job, and so then we had to find other means of financing. We tried to be a kind of commercial web agency, something compete with the kind of advertising money. But it became almost impossible at that time because all the web projects were kind of being done by in-house departments of advertising agencies already at that time. So kind of step by step, we come to the situation now where we first through basically perseverance and personal dedication, we start to make more artistic program, more workshops, and bring more people inside. And slowly we are now growing and getting also public funds for that. We are now in the situation where they were, where we are. The space of Medialab is not interesting for any policy. They don't fund this space. They don't fund infrastructure, they don't fund nothing. They fund events, public events where you have people from the street coming in. And so we now wrap our program in art projects. Basically, we use artists and their projects to have enough cash flow to have this, to support the infrastructure and have it not totally full, the space and everything that also non-funded initiatives can meet and grow to the point where there then, something happens more to them and that we can perhaps get money for them.
But one result I have to
no, sure.
One result is that when the City Museum last year or the year before, I don't know, wanted to make the exhibition about Slovenian art in the 90s, the exhibition wasn't about NSK, it wasn't about export products, it wasn't about anything else. It was an exhibition about Ljudmila. It was identified also by the most formal instance in our curatorial reality there as the artistic occurrence of the 90s, and that's quite significant. And Ljudmila was never in friction with the regime. It wasn't instituted to be in opposition to nationalists in power. It wasn't instituted to be in friction with, let's say, local urbanism policies. It was meant simply very constructively to support all these practices, as Luka mentioned already. And that gave this fruit, plus the hack with the artists being a facade for funding.
So yeah, maybe just two things still kind of coming from what you said. Definitely one of the big realizations which came out of working at Ljudmila even in the 90s and of course later is this face-to-face is a necessity in computer networking. There is a totally different way that we perceive communication from a person that we met before in face-to-face. So if you have a face to put with the name, you get a whole new level of connection and different reaction to this, what the person is saying. Basically, you take them much more seriously, and just works better. So we realized, I think everybody, that it is very much crucial that we get also space to physically meet in a city and of course wider. And the other one is kind of maybe just what I missed. What is the relationship now of Ljudmila to the state? Besides being a provider of cultural events, and we are now slowly getting to the position of being also taken seriously by the different public IT players, So like now we talk with the librarians or museums about digitalization, about free formats, semantic web, open source software, and we are taken seriously. So
you should point this. Wait a minute. Ljudmila is the body in Slovenian state right now that is running the public debate on implementation of European of digital agenda, and is actually coordinating the debate between all the digital players.
it's part we are coordinating the debate for accessibility. There are other parts like the digitalization itself and actual preservation. But you're right, we are now in a kind of taking part in very official forums where the national strategies are formed. So
be brave, say it loud, man. Ljudmila is leading there.
Yeah, well,
was given that opportunity by the state because the state cannot cover it. So
yeah, we are. It is true that we are, in some senses, covering the ass of National Library by providing an easier entry point to like the public databases about culture. They already got 3 times the money to implement something like this, and now we kind of trying to implement it on the sideline of this Culture C project, which, by the way, is really comprehensive resource about all cultural organizations in Slovenia. It's in English, so everybody can understand what's there, even non-Balkan people. And so now, of course, then it was immediately asked of us, now do something in Slovenian, it's so great, but it's all in English. So then we said, okay, we really don't feel like representing the artists to Slovenia. They do that quite well themselves in Slovenian. So we turned it around and made a kind of search engine entry point to the databases, there are like maybe at least 30 databases, all public data, public funded. For most of these projects, though you don't even know the name or that they exist, like normal people. Of course, if you're a specialist, but even then, these are sometimes projects that were going on for 2 years. They made a collection of some data. Now it's there, like an Excel file on the internet, almost. So there is a big goal now how to actually make this interoperable, how to make it accessible to the public, and in EU there is now a kind of tendency by the policymakers to make this accessible for so-called commercial reuse, which is like, we have all these, scientists being paid to, let's say, take pictures of flowers and making them scientifically. And now, let's say somebody makes a book about flowers from this data, which is already being collected, or make a website. something like that. Nobody is quite clear who will benefit financially from all this, but definitely the process is there. And yeah, we are proud and happy to be actually able to influence a little bit the way this turns out in Slovenia.
May I
please.
ask a provocative question? Now that you have taken over the function of the state apparatus, what is left of the radical in radical media?
Well, there are some radical things. Like still, we think that we are kind of with our point of view and our way we do things. We are not trying to be not evil. Let's say that it's this what Google asks. Don't do evil. We also have this. Don't try not do evil. No. And for instance, when we signed a contract for this Culture C portal, it's a 4-year contract where we are a private association taking care of a public portal. And we put in that contract, we put ourselves that should they change their mind and ask somebody else to do the portal, we have to actually provide all the files which are necessary for running the portal and all the SQL database. And so basically we are putting some guards in place in public regulations or calls where we are trying to avoid closing by some third entity eventually, or even by ourselves,
If you turn evil.
Yeah, of course. We are what? Let's not get how to take over Ljudmila. Let's not make it too easy. Associations, they form and they die. Right now, Kut-Franz-Epper-Scheren, this big, it was since 1918 existing association is in terrible problems, like I said already before, because of money. And now it's kind of just a question, do we sell the building to the city, which kind of realize now, actually, they have to sell, so we don't have to give them any money or even assurance that they will be, let back in. Or do we sell it to some kind of private person who promised to keep it a cultural place or what? It's a terrible thing. So now actually every private association is like a company. When you are out of money, someone like Mercator can say, okay, they owe us money, they have you can go into stečaj, bankruptcy, and that's it.
Maybe just still some comments, interventions, provocations, some questions.
If I may just add to what Gerald asked or provoked, it's very difficult to say. There's barely anything of radicality in this kind of a practice. Now when we look like 12 or 13 years of our work, in all these attempts to create open space, gathering space, different from the state institutions, but then again collaborating with them because that's kind of a material backbone of the whole process as well. We are all registered as NGOs. That's non-governmental institution which has specific purpose exactly to enhance civil society in terms of adding or improving or supplementing this functionality of the state in some kind of a practices. So to say what is radical there, we are now thinking also in those terms of being a supplement or kind of addition in all this process again of the imperative of networking, and financing of a bigger network project. What's actually our production in it? Really, what is the production? So there are small portions in this research about a local new avant-garde scene that could be attempt to develop something which differentiates from the, for example, just trying to remember some of the examples to differentiate from the historiographic Kunst historian dominance in dealing with those practices, to create some kind of other line of research. But when you look in the whole practice of those kind of organizations, this is something that is not abandoned, but it happens in, when you remember being burdened by all that I try to describe, then those small breakthroughs.
Diversions.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Why be radical if it's working?
No, but the point was not that I'm putting up a fetish of radicalism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is the other pole which I would not support at all. But if they or you call the conference radical media, I'm just asking what does it mean? And I think what Branka said was quite interesting. Maybe the radicality is in a certain way a defensive form of radicality, and of course also I know that there are micro-political aspects of it that are definitely in small portions radical. Maybe there is also another question connected to it. I was thinking about the double neo-colonial imposture of, on the one hand Soros and other actors. Maybe Esteban could be also important in your field here.
Kulturstiftung.
On one hand, and then even, and there it gets more tricky, neo-colonial leftist activist perspective, also desire towards the East in the last 2 decades. And then there maybe some resistance comes up, because I'm not so much into the whole net time and post-net time business, but maybe there is some mode of subjectivation coming from, let's stay with ex-Yugoslavia, that is stronger than, or it is obviously stronger than being the neo-colonial object. From my perspective, which is not a very substantial perspective in this field, I think that, for instance, the initiatives like Public NetBase have learned a lot from the exchange between post-communist countries and Central European perspective. But this is, let's put it again into a question. Where are the small points of resistance in this double neo-colonial game?
That's a question what we actually struggling at the moment. But it's also happened with the from case to case, Then we started this story about the tech labs, but basically, to be honest, for us, it's actually the biggest problem from the very beginning. The programmers actually usually looks to our platform as just one more, in a sea of entrepreneur, and then they actually try to share, and it was really difficult to really develop some platform to bring them closely in a content what we are actually dealing with, and then it was constant frustration for us, and I said, and in the last 3 years actually our content is actually a bit turned into the level of theory and policy of public ground, and of course then it's a question of politics, but it's not in such a way of technological background. Of course then we learn as well a lot in the meantime, but not in that terms how when we started. So
maybe one thing I would maybe add as a moderator, one thing which would be maybe then again answering to the question of the radicality of the activism. Maybe I would say this was our experience here running MAMA in Zagreb, is actually that what we are maybe probably looking is a specific mode of activity which is, let's say, most like a passive or passivity. Actually, what we are maybe buying is kind of time. We're almost in a sense reluctant, though we are actively activists in a sense, culture or political ones, actually that you are somehow buying this something which also Luka was mentioning, that nobody will finance you kind of media lab or research in this kind of thing, or very rarely one will do it. Actually, that our experience then having a venue which is not, let's say, a proper media lab, or which now has a hack lab within it in Mama, somehow to buy time to actually maybe even to have, let's say now very pathetically, to have this free time or schole, really to somehow to think some things over and then to act. And it's not actually, so radicality maybe in this sense would be kind of reluctant radicality. And the diversion of it, that you have space like it, Kuda, then some also spaces in Ljubljana elsewhere, so that this kind of radicality is a kind of, it's not reactive, or it's not defensive, but maybe it's kind of reluctant. So they are actually just buying somehow time to do, if possible, so nobody can guarantee some kind of small scale intervention. And even in the cases where, for example, you in Novi Sad or we in Zagreb, they have been engaged very prominently in also in kind of broader political action, even at that time, even if you go into this kind of prominency, then you're somehow again hiding, seeking the hiding place of, let's say, this kind of space where things can happen. So nobody can guarantee that they will happen, but somehow they can happen. This is maybe the word of media lab or hack lab as a format, that you have this kind of reluctancy, luxury to somehow to at least to allow things to happen and not to immediately to put them down by some imperative, be it state, etatist or commercial.
I think that the notion of radical media is here obviously wrapped in a certain historic context or conjecture, which is tumultuous to say the least here. And I'd agree that defined a very different subject or subjectivity across the countries of the region, but that for the last 10 years situations have changed radically, and if we are speaking of the state, then it's obvious that state is now being withered away by the forces of the crisis and crisis management and sort of capitalist backlash against the state, and maybe just the space of putting in question of radicality now is, aren't we failing to capture the state process enough in order to transform what's going on? So I think that in that sense it has changed. Much of these initiatives have sprung as opposed to the state, in opposition to the dominant policies of nationalist governments and politics of war. But I think that now balances have changed radically, and radicality in that sense is up for redefinition in terms of practice, and also where do you engage the public process? Can you see the state as a public turf and engage there? So it's maybe not the media that are radical, it's institutions that have to be radicalized in a certain way. That's maybe just a speculation, but I think that that is an open question, at least here in Croatia. That is obviously the situation with social democrats being now in power, but that really mattering very little in terms of economic policy and fiscal consolidation that is going on, not to a radical degree, but to a significant degree. And then the question for the politics of the left is, what do you do in that situation? And it's very difficult to think of in terms of taking over the power, because there are two weaknesses. One is external, that it's very hard to get in there, but also that it's internal. How do you find different mode of subjectivation that you really have people working on that agenda? I think there is weakness from within. I think.
Yeah, no, I wanted to, with the highest form of respect for the Slovenian state, but I don't think that, I mean, this debate on the relation with the state is central in the sense that otherwise we didn't understand much from the lesson of the notion of tacticality from the 90s. My perspective is like that this project, like the whole, this project rooted in this region and also the whole digital culture and digital media scene in the 90s was like connected to like a geopolitical macro phenomenon. Was like precisely that dismembering of Yugoslavia, but also this geopolitical tension crossing the whole Europe, and it was a form, let's say, a vector of antagonism that was very palpable, very, very strong. And today, of course, and after that, we had different other big historical events. We had like a period of we had 9/11. We had a period in which the world was like crossed by the other tension, and then this incredible financial crisis today. So if this cultural center, if this form of cultural production don't, especially those ones that work on the notion of radical media, don't cross these main structures, these main vectors of conflict or even political antagonism, and now today this financial environment where we find to live ourselves, I found it very sterile debate. No, we were coming, because it was part. I grew up with the same media scene. We are coming from a very, let's say, vigorous period in terms of energies. No, and today there are still, energies shaking the world, but I have the feeling that we are not able to cross. This morning was interesting. You see these people coming from London mentioning Marx every second line. Why do you think you have like this peculiar curiosity for Marx today? Just for it's not from nostalgic characters. So today we have the same problem. Maybe also the Italian latitudes, the institution, the social centers, the new experimental institutions set up in the 90s, they don't work anymore. And we are now going through the same crisis. I would say these days, this very month, because also the political situation in Italy is like a completely weird event in itself. But it's precisely the problem of crossing the new form of antagonism. So, don't you think so today? Instead of dealing with the local municipalities. This is very important. They're part of the tacticality of our life. No, we work for our university, art galleries. I don't know. So the focus of the debate, in my opinion, should be, in other words, talking about cultural formats, media formats.
I think it's hard to avoid anyway today even taking a part in the crisis, let's say. But if I perhaps attempt to trace this radicality from the 20 years ago, when the first radical idea we had was kind of, oh look, this radio and TV and you can get your message across much more powerful or perhaps in a more flexible way just by using internet. First radical kind of. Then second was quite soon after, okay, we have this internet, but perhaps we need to critique and look at it critically and not make ourselves into evangelists of internet. And so this was the kind of moment of net time, I would say. Now, my personal from being a programmer, also free software was a very radical change of or idea in the 90s when everybody who knew like the mainstream image of a programmer was Bill Gates with the billions of dollars that he made from being a programmer. So today I would say it's not anymore enough to be actually just speaking about internet and critiquing it. Now we are actually living it, you know, every moment. There is like, nobody was expecting the phones to become so important in the 90s. Nobody was talking about them. They just came and took over, you know, basically. We were all on the websites, but slowly, you know, this came into the pocket. And now what is kind of radical is to be, for me, is to actually critique the mobile phone, the operating system. It's, let's say, for me, Mozilla is the radical media of today. And also why I think it's important to actually participate today in the policy making process, because this is now is the capitalist interest is very well aware of what is the danger and the opportunity for them in this medium. So now we have to actually still be on the lookout, and it's not like, oh, we have said everything and now we don't have to be radical. And like as a medium, I think taking now web has finally gotten to the point where it's possible to implement any kind of software on the web. It's possible to implement a video phone service in all public internet, in the web, in the open kind of medium way. But it is not clear still what this will mean. How this will be defined is by use. Or like, there was a lot of, kind of, we have Google, you know, now as the kind of the big elephant in everybody's mind. Are we really attacking Google somehow, or is their dominant position of search kind of left unchallenged because it's too big? Seems an insurmountable problem. Even Microsoft is nominally trying to of course compete, but it's like not really working. That's it.
May I contribute a bit?
Yeah.
My plan was to do this tomorrow in my talk. It's entitled somewhere around this topic. There's a big difference between an individual position and the group action. The radicality of an institution usually is deriving from the contrast there is between the vision and values inside that space of freedom there, and circumstances where it is trying to function as a democratic corrective, like Branka said, or as some other machine for meaning, you know. And in Slovenia, yes, paradoxically, I enjoy the fact that you also find it funny. To me, Slovenia today is funny in that way. In Slovenia, there's not much conflict in that level where you have to fight for some, let's say, status of digital sphere. So you just get into the president's office or the minister's office and say, you know what, we got to enforce this European digital agenda, and this means open government data principles, this means public reuse of reuse of public data. And they say, well, yeah, why not? Just please do it for us. And then you say, well, okay, so why be radical when you just push it through? So just fix it. It all depends whether you are interested. Now, this you might find this silly, but you know, I'm always making a difference when we talk about things. Are we interested in the health of our statement about reality, or we are interested in the health of reality? Now, the answer to this question puts my interlocutor in one of the two very conflicting pigeonholes. You either want to talk a lot or you want to do things about reality, you know. And here in Slovenia, in a funny way, being activist today means going out, kicking the president of the country in the guts and saying, fuck you, we want to fix this digital agenda. And then he says, sure, do it. He's not influenced by the other side. There is no other side on some topics. And that's kind of cool. If instead we want to search for an individual radical position because we like being radical, Now that's kind of great. It's completely out there for you to try, but it gets boring after a while because you notice you don't get things done by always looking for a radical position to be in. It looks like a fashion statement and not like an active lifestyle. At least to me, sorry for being direct about it.
Yeah, so maybe with this, fine.
Radicality comes from the users, and because new media is a product of competitive development, and the developer, the companies itself, they don't really know all the options, possibilities, and consequences of the new products. They're concentrating to do it earlier or faster than the competitors. And this personal aspect is very important. And if I may go back to this historical part you started with, and again to the C3, it's not to forget that C3 was established rather late in '96, and because of the problem of the Soros Internet Office, because it was a very bureaucratic office. And really a place where you could have the feeling that the people sitting literally behind their desk and they are grabbing. So organizing the Meta Forum, of course we went there and we had not even help, but no way of cooperation. And again, going back to the C3, it's they didn't do anything with let's say new media before '97. So they organized some exhibitions like video installations and things like that, but there was no real focus on it. And when it was established, it was a shock for the Hungarian independent media activist community that they got the Hungarian Telecom as a partner, because we were working at that time very hard to establish Hungarian access for all, with all the help of the Dutch friends, and we reached a certain point, and then the Hungarian Telecom came in, and they started to buy up content. So they did the verse, what they could do, and this was the moment when they joined to this coalition which formed the C3. So anyway, I just wanted to say that the personal aspect is extremely important, and without this, Hungary was in a good position. The Soros was there, and except the Meta Forum, nothing really happened at that time, and you were much faster in terms of establishing independent, even no budget situations for possible radical usage of new media.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
But in our perspective, I have to add, from Ljudmila, we used to come to Meta Forum in '95 and '6, I believe I was there.
4, 5, 6.
I wasn't in the first one, I failed. I didn't have a proper passport, so for me to travel, never mind that. 5 and 6 I was there. That was pilgrimage. That was a great place to be. The Meta Forum.
But it was independent of
the Art Academy, and exactly. That was the Art Academy. It was your personal. And I remember also Susie, she came in the picture in '93. We were all meeting in Venice Biennial, establishing the SCCA network, feeling good about ourselves and shaking hands with the man. But I also remember when she was establishing the C-Cube, that was actually the name, not C3, right? She was coming to Ljudmila, reading all our materials about establishing exactly the same thing a few years before within the internet program and Soros. And she was actually bulldozing that each and every of the possibly, even vaguely possibly transnational idea, she was bulldozing it with the ideas of establishing a bridge with Silicon Graphics, the non-existent company, right? And Medak, who was later sold to German Telecom. That same manager that was running, the German guy running Medak came later to run Croatian Telecom when it was bought by the same German guy. It's amazing, it's the neo-colonialism at its best. And it has a German uniform on it. Like they say it is. Yeah. I mean, the German logo, I apologize. Okay, and that is, I believe, the same thing that made C-Cube possible is exactly what killed any potential of doing anything radical. Collaborating with C-Cube back then was a matter of prestige and of individual conformism of the other.
Literally, it has changed a little bit because Susie had a very good sense of about what's in and what's hot. And if she forgot Matthew Varney, then she realized that Ljudmila or Absolute No might be more interesting than that sort of art she was supporting.
Back to people and their profiles.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe with this we close. Thank you all for your patience, for your participation. Thank you now here, Tom, Luka, and Zoran. We'll be back at 6.